When it comes to photography, there are so many different elements to learn and understand. When you're starting out, it can feel overwhelming because there are virtually an infinite number of tutorials online to teach you whatever you'd like to know. But I'd suggest that there's only one thing you need to understand in order to take good photos. While it may seem super simple, understanding how to utilize this will help you break through creative limitations that you may be feeling and allow you to be free to bring your ideas to life. Now, before we start, I'd like to say I know there are a ton of different things that you can learn and practice to improve your photography. And while those are all well and good, I think there's only one thing you truly need to know in order to be able to take photos to your true potential. With that being said, the only thing you need to really understand in order to take good photographs is the exposure triangle. When I was starting out with photography, I was pretty overwhelmed with my camera and the amount of buttons and dials and words on it that I had no idea what any of these settings meant. And while I was exploring online, I came across the exposure triangle. And once I understood how to use it, I felt like I was no longer limited by my knowledge with my camera, and I was able to just freely create the photos that I had wanted to create all this time. The exposure triangle gets its name from the fact that it's comprised of three main elements that control the exposure or overall brightness of your image. Light is responsible for everything that we see, and if you know how to properly utilize these three tools at your disposal, then you're only limited by your imagination and experience. So what are these three elements? Firstly, let's look at aperture. The easiest way to understand aperture is to think of the human eye. Depending on the amount of light in the environment, the pupil changes size. In an environment with lots of light, such as a bright outdoor setting, the pupil will shrink to let in less light. In a dark environment where light is limited, the pupil expands in order to allow more light to pass through. Camera aperture works in the same way. When we increase the aperture on our lens, what we are doing is closing it off and shrinking the hole that light is able to pass through. And when we are lowering the aperture, we are opening it up to allow more light to hit our camera's sensor. This has two distinct effects on our image. Firstly, by controlling the amount of light that we allow to pass through our lens, we are adjusting the overall brightness or exposure of our image. Secondly, aperture changes the amount of our image that's in focus, otherwise known as depth of field. Let's take a look at our subject here. Currently, our aperture is set pretty wide open at f2.0. As a result, we are allowing plenty of light to pass through the lens and hit our camera's sensor, and therefore are increasing the exposure of our image. Another effect this has is that it provides us with a very shallow depth of field. The background is blurry and only our subject is in focus. This is useful when you want the focus of the photograph to be on a specific subject or point in the image. Now, as we increase our aperture, notice the two things that happen. The most obvious effect that this has on our image is that it is allowing less light to pass through, and therefore the image becomes darker and darker. Doing so will require us to compensate for the lack of light using another tool at our disposal, which we'll get to next. The second effect that increasing or closing off the aperture has on our image is the depth of field. Take a look at these two photos. On the left, you can see how having our aperture open to f2 gives us that soft, blurry background, and on the right you can see how closing our aperture off to f11 brings more of the background into focus. Another helpful tip for getting that nice, shallow depth of field is that the further your subject is from the background, the easier it will be to keep the background out of focus. Now, we talked about compensating for our lack of light with another tool at our disposal, which brings me to our next element in the exposure triangle, shutter speed. In most cases, in between the lens and your camera's sensor lies a shutter. The shutter acts as a barrier in front of your camera's sensor, and as it opens and closes, it allows light into the camera, generating your image. So how do we use the shutter? Shutter speed is measured by how long the shutter remains open, and that measurement is typically in seconds. For example, a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second lets in light for 1/50th of a second. The longer the shutter remains open, the longer light is allowed to hit our camera's sensor. The longer that light is allowed to hit the sensor, the brighter our image becomes. Therefore, lowering the shutter speed is one way we can compensate for a darker image, and increasing it can darken our image if it's too bright. However, the shutter not only affects light, it's also responsible for how motion is captured. Faster shutter speeds reduce motion blur, while slower shutter speeds increase motion blur. Take a look at these photos. The shot on the left is with a slower shutter speed of 1/6 of a second, and the shot on the right is a higher shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second. Notice a difference in the blur of the image. The shutter remaining open longer allows us to capture the movement of the water, which results in a nice, milky, soft texture. Keeping the shutter speed high allows us to capture the movement in a specific place and time. Depending on what you're shooting, you'll adjust your shutter speed accordingly. For example, if you're shooting sports or a dance routine, you might want a higher shutter speed so that you can capture the action and reduce any motion blur. Whereas if you want to add some motion blur to your image or to play with light streaks, you would decrease your shutter speed. So what if you want a high shutter speed in order to capture the action of whatever you're shooting, but also want a higher aperture in order to keep more of your image in focus, but don't have a lot of light? This brings us to our third and final element of the exposure triangle, ISO. Where aperture and shutter speed physically control the amount of light allowed into the camera, in relation to digital photography, ISO is used to describe how sensitive the camera's sensor is to light. A lower ISO value makes the image less sensitive to light, and in contrast, a higher value makes it more sensitive. So when do we adjust our ISO? Typically, ISO is adjusted after we've set our desired aperture and shutter speed, as these two elements are responsible for the overall look of our image. Once we have our shutter speed and aperture set, we either bring the ISO up or down depending on the exposure we're going for. If we're shooting in a bright situation, we'll need to decrease ISO in order to bring the exposure down. Conversely, in a low light situation, we'll need to increase our ISO in order to properly expose the image. However, there is a catch to increasing our ISO value that you need to be aware of. A byproduct of increasing ISO is increased image noise. This is caused by your camera's sensor being too sensitive to light, and depending on the sensor you have, your threshold for what is too sensitive may vary. Take a look at this image. Clearly it's underexposed, and we need to increase our ISO in order to bring the exposure up. But watch what happens as we increase it. Increasing our ISO brightens up our shot, but also produces more noise. So that's my brief overview of the exposure triangle, and the reason I say that I think it's the one thing you really need to understand in order to take good photographs is because once you understand how to use these three elements, you're free to just flex your creative muscles. I know I didn't touch on any other aspects of what makes a good photograph, like composition and how to use light, because as somebody who's pretty much entirely self-taught, I really believe that the best way to get better at photography is to just go shoot. You can get wrapped up in compositional rules, but at the end of the day, the best way to increase your skill as a photographer and to build your own unique vision is to just go shoot on a regular basis, shooting what you think looks good. Once you understand the exposure triangle and you know when to increase or decrease your shutter speed, aperture, ISO, you now need to go do the most important part of developing your skill, which is practice. Photography is like any other skill in that the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. That's why so much advice you see online is just go shoot. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this video and got something out of it. I know it's geared a little more towards people who are just starting out, who might not know what these things are, but regardless who you are and where you are in your photography journey, I'm grateful that you're watching this. Don't forget to like and subscribe because I'm going to be back every Monday with more. I'm going to go get some work done, and I hope that all of you are getting after it this week too. Keep on creating, and I'll see you next Monday. Hard cut.